Hello, and welcome to this bonus edition of the ancient empires from the Old Testament. And the reason why it's a bonus edition is because the Greek world, the Hellenistic world, does not appear in the Old Testament unless you happen to believe one particular interpretation of the book of Daniel and maybe a few others. But this time would happen during what we call the intertestamental period. This is the time, as it sounds, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, hence intertestamental. This is also the time when you might find, if you go to a Catholic or Greek Orthodox or some Anglican Bibles, and you'll see a bunch of books of the Bible that you won't recognize. Books like Tobit and Bel and the Dragon. Well, these particular books happen in this time period, most famously the books of Maccabees. And we'll get to those here in a little bit. Also, you may wonder to yourself, exactly why is the New Testament written in Greek? I thought the people of the New Testament were under the thumb of the Romans. Well, we'll get to that as well as we continue on. So let's talk about the Hellenistic Age. Now, Hellene, what we would say is Hellene. The Hellene are what the Greeks called themselves. And scholars of the ancient world divide up the Greek time into multiple times, but for us, the most important times would be the Hellenic period and the Hellenistic period. I know it's getting confusing already, but don't worry. All you'll need to remember is the Hellenistic period. Now, why is it called the Hellenistic period? Well, this is the time when the Greeks went out and brought Greek culture to the rest of the ancient world that they came in contact with directly, namely the Middle East, as well as the ancient Mediterranean. And as they came in contact with it, it didn't just stay static, just like American culture doesn't stay static when it is just in one place, but rather integrates and starts having dialogue with the cultures that they encounter. And this gave rise to the Hellenistic period, which was not purely Greek, but also not like anything that had come before. And the catalyst for this was a general by the name of Alexander of Macedon, known to us as Alexander the Great. Now, when Alexander the Great finished his conquests, he died, and he didn't really leave a good succession. That meant that his empire, which was massive, built on a lot of the conquests of people that had come before him, was divided up amongst his generals. And there was a fight for his throne. And oftentimes cultures and peoples would be stuck in the crosshairs. That's what happened to the Jews, especially as the Ptolemies down in Egypt and the Seleucids up around Asia Minor began fighting and fighting and fighting. Now, this is a map of roughly how everything was divided up at the end here. And by the way, you'll need to remember this city, or might want to remember this. This is Pella in the state of Macedon. Pella is where Alexander the Great came from. He was not Greek. So let's talk a little bit about him. Let's talk about the ramifications that happened. And we'll see how this plays into our discussions about the Bible, and maybe even the Old Testament. So, dividing it up, we've got the rise and fall of Alexander, the rulers, the culture, and the role for Israel. Alexander, as I said, was born in Pella, Macedon, in 356 BC. Now, the thing to know about Macedon is a kingdom north of Greece. It's a mountainous, rocky area. In fact, as rocky and mountainous as the Greek area is, and we'll talk a little bit about that, it was more so. So let's talk about the Greeks first. The Greeks we encountered with Persia. The Greeks have given Western civilization many of the ways of talking about itself and talking about the priorities that Western civilization has. The Greeks were divided amongst themselves. They were not a cohesive unit, and only became a semi-cohesive unit when facing off against the Persians. As you'll remember, when the Persians attacked, not all the Greeks sided with Greece. Some of the best generals, and certainly some of the best in the Navy, admirals there, were actually Greeks from Greek city-states that had settled along the coast of Turkey. Now, how did this happen? Well, the Greeks had a very interesting way of doing government. They had a much more individualistic understanding than the cultures around them, though it should be noted not nearly as individualistic as we have today in America. What would happen is cities would get so large, and then groups of people, either voluntarily or sometimes involuntarily, would be sent away to form colonies. And they would start these new city-states, which may or may not have actually had relationships or even fealty to the mother city. This is how the Greeks started to spread, not just across the Mediterranean or down into what we would think as the Aegean Sea, which is Greece, but yes, across the Mediterranean and even up around the Black Sea. Many of the news reports that we hear happening in the war over there in the Ukraine, a lot of those cities can actually trace their lineage back to the Greeks. And this is a fascinating discussion, and I would love to just talk about this a little bit more, but unfortunately we just can't with the time constraints. But the point is that the Greek culture was spread out and it was dominant, and it was already this mindset of growth and expansion. Now, just to the north of Greece lay Macedon. And the king of Macedon, Philip, had a son, Alexander. He wanted the best for Alexander, and the best happened to be Greek. And the kingdom of Macedon, which was still a comparatively wild place next to Greece, looked down at the Greeks just to their south and started bringing in people to educate their citizens. In fact, Alexander himself was educated by the famous philosopher Aristotle, one of the two great philosophers under Socrates, under the Socratic method. You had Socrates, Plato, and Plato had Aristotle. And so Aristotle teaches Alexander all of these things about Greek learning. Aristotle's from Athens, and what had happened in Greece was, after the war with Persia, the Greeks had worn themselves out with infighting. Many Greek city-states rose and fell, and by the end of it, everyone was an easy target for Macedon, which swooped in and took over Greece under the reign of Philip. Because of this, Alexander would have picked up a lot of Greek thought, and he combined the Greek outlook of life and their religion with the understanding of power and monarchy that he inherited from the Macedonian area. What he really picked up from them, though, was this cultural battle between East and West, most notably seen in the Greeks' desire for revenge on Persia. Alexander's father dies when he is still 20 years old. The circumstances of Philip's death are still surrounded in mystery, and there are many stories around it which make one a little nervous about Alexander's home life. But he manages to consolidate power quite quickly, and consolidates it with the Greeks, taking their militaries and combining them underneath his military. Now, before Alexander had taken the throne, there were many battles here between Persia, what we call the Persian Wars. And you can see all of these various battles here. This would eventually lead to the final peace, and the final peace between the Greeks and the Persians, which everyone must have assumed would just be less a peace and more pause in the fighting. When Alexander becomes king in 336, he begins to mobilize the Greek forces that his father has taken over since the fall of Greece, and he turns them all towards Persia. The first battle that is of note. There were several battles, but the Battle of the Granicus River. Here, the brilliant tactics of the Macedonians completely and utterly rout the Persians over in Turkey. This is followed by the Battle of Issus. And the Battle of Issus really marks the conclusion of not just the war against Persia, but Persia itself. It was such a thorough trouncing. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, number one, because military history is not my forte, and number two, because it doesn't really factor in as much here. But you should know exactly why this happened, or at least the broad outlines. The Greeks had two things going for them. First off, the Greeks brought with them this understanding of an infantry formation called the hoplite, which moved, as it were, in this long line of soldiers carrying shields and long spears who were able to defend and attack in a strong, steady force forward. This meant that if you had infantry especially, but even cavalry coming up against this main wall, it was like a mobile fortress of men. And it was very difficult to break through that. This was used effectively, by the way, against the Persians, against what you might have seen in Hollywood movies. It was not a good idea for you to be a lone wolf, as it were, in these formations. And this kind of formation will be seen over and over and over again throughout history. The Swiss use it to defend themselves in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And the Vikings will actually use this to great effect in fighting and taking over lands with their round shields, even though the rectangular shields were the things the Greek used. And I promised I wouldn't take too long, but it really is quite exciting. What the Macedonians added to this was their very mobile cavalry units. And here Alexander would often lead the charge, sometimes very recklessly. And so you had this 1-2 punch, the slow, steady movement of the main army, the main infantry, with these strike forces of cavalry. And it was just too much for the Persians to eventually withstand. And so Persia itself collapsed. Alexander wasn't happy with this, and he kept on going. And he took his army to the very limits of the Persian power, which bring us to the gates of India, and actually to India itself. Alexander probably would have liked to have gone even further, but he was hundreds of miles away from any kind of known world. And so his men just said, we need to go back. Finally, Alexander bowed to pressure. He turned around, although in a way not to lose face, and headed back. To this day, it's interesting, you can still find influences of the Greeks in Asia as well as down in India. Most notably, we can see this in various kingdoms that were set up on the Greek model, of course, bringing in their own Asian influences. He will die in Babylon in 323, and for all of his accomplishments, he is known for, or what else he is known for, is one of his largest failures. That he failed to list a successor. This meant that his empire was divided, and there was fighting for generations afterwards, the generations of the generals who took over and filled that power vacuum between the various kingdoms, as it were, of the post-Alexander world. It's finally divided between his generals. So, let's talk about the rulers then. We see here that this is broken down into one period. The most important rulers that you will need to know are the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Seleucids will eventually push back the Antigones, and they will take over this area after the Ptolemies have taken it over, and then they've pulled back. So, let's keep on talking. Now, there were multiple wars of succession here. These wars, you don't need to memorize all of them or their importance, who came out on top. What you do need to know is the general structure. And let's welcome back. We're going to be talking about Greek culture now. The culture of the Hellenistic world. The Greeks, as anyone knows from studying Western civilization or the various sub-areas of the humanities, understands the importance of Greece. Many scholars of Christianity, though maybe they're not Christians themselves, list the Greeks and Greek thought, more importantly, Greek ways of framing issues, as important to understanding Christianity. This will take place hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after the Hellenistic kingdoms. But it is important that the groundwork is laid. I'd really like to talk more about the Bible and the influence about the Bible a little bit later. So I'm going to try and keep it just to the Greek world and Greek culture here. Now we talked a little bit about the way that the Greeks would set themselves up. And really right off the bat, we are dealing with Hellenism because Alexander's generals aren't themselves Greeks per se, but rather people who are within the Macedonian court. So they are people who are outsiders to Greek culture, who have embraced Greek culture and they've put a particular spin on it to make their own. Now, the kingship of these various rulers is interesting. The kingship here was something that was not really accepted within Greek culture. Greeks had a point where they would have tyrants. It's actually where we get the word tyrants from, which were rulers, less a hereditary monarchy, and more a dictator who would pop up. Sometimes the dictator would be beneficial, other times the dictator would have to be overthrown. Because of this, various city-states within Greece adopted their own peculiar forms of government. Now, we know that the Spartans, for instance, adopted a landed aristocracy, which was brutal and terrorized people around them, as well as people living within their confines there. In fact, they were so focused on terror that they trained their young from a very young age in how to be not just warriors, but terrorists, if you will. They are contrasted often with the Athenians. The Athenians had their own form of, we wouldn't consider it a total democracy, but it allowed for more representation than the areas around them. And it is considered the first of the democratic movements in the world. Now, I stated earlier that the Greeks would go out and they would send settlers. Oftentimes this would happen when a family was out of power, and rather than stay with the people that defeated them, the families that defeated them, they would actually move and settle elsewhere. In addition to this, you had these city-states pop up. And I told you, there are some very famous ones that you may not have thought of. For instance, the town of Marseille in France is actually a Greek colony. And the area at the very southern tip of the Italian peninsula was once called Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece, by the Romans, because so many Greek cities lay there and Greek colonies lay in its confines. They could be found as far north as around the Black Sea and set up settlements there. Once they joined in or threw in their lot with Alexander, though, they started spreading the Greek way of thinking. Now, I have to be clear, this does not mean that every place they encountered adopted Greek mythology or became Athenian city-states. Instead, what happened was the world was framed within the Greek way of thinking. This can be seen most notably, for instance, in the Epistle to the Romans, where Paul talks about kind of a duality between body and spirit. That is a very Greek way of explaining things. It doesn't mean that the Bible has shifted or is incorrect or anything, but rather that Paul was using the language that the people in the wider Mediterranean would have understood. And so he takes the Jewish thoughts and tries to explain them that way. They are going to then Hellenize, what we call Hellenize their neighbors. Now, what this means is that they would build places that would have been familiar to the Greeks. Namely, they would have built temples, they would have built gymnasiums, they would have built baths. And these would be either accepted wholeheartedly or rejected completely, with a huge spectrum in between. They subjected the peoples that were there, they controlled the levers of power, but the people would have this 1-2 punch from the levers of power being Greek, as well as the culture that they slowly found themselves surrounded by being Greek as well. They would set up many Greek city-states. Alexander was known for this, setting up many towns called, you guessed it, Alexandria. And Alexandria, Egypt, is of course a town that was founded by this Macedonian empire. It would become eventually the headquarters of the Ptolemies in Egypt, and a center for major learning in the ancient world. A little bit more on that later on, because that does factor into Jewish history. One last point is there is an individualistic shift that begins to happen. Before, as we talk through the ancient empires, people would express their own individualities, but the powerful elites, the powerful kings, seemed to dominate completely. The Greeks are far more interested in individualistic expression, and they will bring that with them to the areas that they conquest. It is one of the beginnings of the notion of the rise of the individualism that so marks Western culture as unique. As you can imagine, when they would interact with people, language doesn't stay the same. Just think of English. English in America isn't the same as English in Britain. Words are different, phrases are different, and idioms are very different. American English can sometimes be as incomprehensible to other people over across the pond, as it were, as British English is for us. A lot of times I have to turn on the subtitles just to understand what they're saying. The same thing went for Greek as well. Before this, Hellenic Greek was the pure Greek of the Greek islands, and no doubt the different islands and cities had their own way of speaking Greek, their own particular accents and dialects. But as they moved around, they started to pick up words and phrases and ideas from the places that they would interact with. And this gave rise to a new form of Greek called Koine Greek, which is very different, although still comprehensible, to Hellenic Greek. Koine Greek, or Hellenistic Greek, but we'll use Koine Greek because that's what it's called in language circles, differ, number one, in picking up different words from the areas that the Greeks would interact with. And secondly, it also was a lot more lax. The interesting thing about language is it often moves from a great deal of high structure and very definite ways of saying things down to ways that are more colloquial or that fit themselves to the shortcuts that we use when we pronounce words. This language, this Greek language, therefore, can make it a little bit difficult if you're a student. It's much easier to read the Hellenic because it follows the structure of the language so much more. But of course, structures of language become fuzzy when we interact with other places. Just think of various English words that we have picked up from around the world that have to be shoehorned, as it is, into English. It would finally, this language, these building projects, this government, but mostly the language and the building projects, leads to Greek becoming the dominant culture in the ancient world, something that will continue even to the Roman day. Let's get ahead of ourselves a little bit here. Remember how I said at the outset why it's curious that the New Testament is written in Greek. After all, the Greeks weren't in charge of Judea when Jesus was alive. It was the Romans. Well, Latin would be spoken in official decrees within the larger Roman world. And Latin would be a little bit more prevalent on the western half of the empire, although you should still know the various dialects, especially the various Celtic dialects and eventually Germanic dialects. But on the eastern half, things had become a lot more homogenized since Alexander the Great. This led to the language being spoken in business and in common everyday interactions in society as being Greek. Some of the most famous histories in Rome, written by Romans, were written in Greek. Although many of these could be the result that when the Romans did take over Greece much later on, they would take slaves, and the most well-educated would be people who would be teaching the youngsters and would have side jobs of writing Roman histories. And we see this in Polybius and other great historians. So there is a lot of Roman literature that is written in Greece. And in the eastern half of the empire, Greek would have been the language people would have spoken. It would have been the language to transmit, and so the New Testament wrote in Koine Greek. Not everyone was happy about this, but many people did adopt the Greek culture. This could be found in the gymnasium, which is more than just a fitness club of today, but also a gathering place. And the Greeks had such a high, they placed physical work, and not physical work, but physical leisure and sports at such a high degree that the gymnasium was more than just a place where you went to work out privately like it is today, but was also a place where competitions would happen. We have that most famous of competition, the Olympics, even today, which was a resurrected ancient Greek sporting challenge. In fact, when people invaded the Greeks and they saw this happening, they asked, well, what do they compete for? Thinking it was going to be land or prize money, and it was like, no, it's just a crown, a simple laurel crown. And the notion was that status was so important that people would compete for these things. So this physical exercise and physical competition were very integral, just as much as Greek learning it was. Arts and literature, we see this a lot too, don't we? We see the arts and literature even come down to us today. Let's think about this. Philosophy gets its start, most notably with Socrates, but with others as well. And we see pre-Socratics as well as other people come through here. We do also see a lot of the plays and theater emerge as well, especially we see this in Greek drama. All right, finally, let's talk about the Bible. All right, the timeline of the Bible here, we deal with the Ptolemaic rule. Oh, let me try this again. We deal with the Ptolemaic rule, the growth of Hellenistic influence, and we've already kind of talked about these first four. Now, let me explain what happens here briefly. Historically, and then the impact that has in the intertestamental period, and then later on has with the larger world. Okay, the Ptolemies take over, and the Jewish people are not happy with this. They've been living pretty well under the Persians. The Persians themselves have exercised a light touch, and that was really the way that Persia tried to do things. If they needed to come down hard on people, they were not afraid to come down hard on people and could be just as brutal as all the other regimes we talked about. But we notice from the Bible several stories where the Jews feel a sense of relief, most notably in the book of Esther, at the way that they are treated by the Persians. So when the Greeks come in, they start wanting to displace Jewish cultural identity with Greek cultural identity, most notably seen in their polytheism and their very foreign attitudes. In fact, today, if we were to go back in time, as foreign as the Jewish understanding might be, the Greek world would have been far different, far more different than the Jewish world, which is something for us to think about, and it's hard for us to get our heads around. When the Ptolemies do take over, they start to repress, and so then what happens is the Seleucids come over and they crank that up to 11. This will eventually lead to the Maccabean revolt here. I had to find it here. this gentleman here, Antiochus IV, he gave himself the name Epiphanes. We might know Epiphany from our own church here, which means the revelation, and the implication it's the revelation of a god. He considered himself quite good. He would talk. He came in and sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple, which, as you know, pig is an unclean animal, so it was an ultimate affront and an unnecessary affront to the Jewish people. In fact, he pushed them so hard trying to break them that they did break, but they broke against him. What would end up happening is in a small, in one of the towns, a priest was going to make a sacrifice and refused. And another priest said, well, it's only a little sacrifice, I'll go ahead and do it myself. And this first priest and his family killed the Jewish priest who was going to make a sacrifice to the idols of Greece. And at that moment they were up in rebellion. The name Maccabees is not actually the name of the family, but rather is the nickname given to the most famous son, Judas Maccabeus. And Maccabee means the hammer, Judas the hammer, who would fight a guerrilla war against the Greeks and would get some level of success, especially as the Seleucids started waning so much for Antiochus Epiphanes being a god. But then it would all come undone when eventually Rome became the dominant power. And Rome would come in, this is under Pompey the Great, would come in and pretty much kick out the Seleucids and destroy their empire, taking over Judea. And what would happen after that is a family with loose links to the dynasty of the Maccabees and no links to the kingship of Israel, named the Idumeans, would come in and be given the client kingdom status here. Now, what ends up happening is that most famous of ruler, who is not himself Jewish but married to a fringe member of the Hasmonean dynasty, would become, or fringe member, of the Maccabees, forming and starting the Hasmonean dynasty, would be Herod the Great, who would go rebuild the temple and also try and hunt down Jesus because he was threatened. But he himself was not actually Jewish, but was installed by the Romans as a way of ensuring Roman influence on the formerly Greek area that was Judea.